The room is cold, sterile. Its walls a sickly shade of green under flickering fluorescent lights. 3 identical faces stare blankly at the ceiling, their eyes wide but unseeing, as if peering into a void only they can comprehend. The triplets, Anna, Clara, and Elise, lie side by side on metal gurneys in a locked ward of St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital, 1993. Their wrists are bound with soft restraints, not for violence but because each, in her own way, has tried to claw her way out of her own mind. A nurse, her face pale, whispers to a colleague, "They spoke in unison again last night, like they were one person." Her voice trembles. It wasn't English. It wasn't anything. This is no ordinary case. The triplets, born in a small Ohio town in 1975, have baffled doctors, psychologists, and even priests for years. Their minds seem to weave together in ways that defy logic, as if they share a single consciousness fractured into 3 bodies. They finish each other's sentences, scream in perfect harmony, and, most chillingly, seem to know things no one has told them. Secrets about the hospital staff, about their own past, about the world beyond the locked doors. But what truly terrifies those who study them is this. When one triplet feels pain, all 3 bleed. You're about to enter a story that will pull you into the darkest corners of the human psyche, where the boundaries of individuality dissolve, and what's left is something no science can explain. What could bind 3 sisters so deeply that their minds become one? Is it a gift, a curse, or something far older and more sinister than anyone dares to admit? By the time this story ends, you'll question whether the human mind is a sanctuary or a prison. This case isn't just about 3 girls in a hospital ward. It's about the fragility of what makes us human, the terrifying possibility that our thoughts might not be our own, and the haunting truth that some secrets are better left buried. Stay with us until the end, because the revelation waiting for you will unravel everything you thought you knew about the mind. If you're ready to dive into this unsettling mystery, hit that like button to help others discover the dark truths we're about to uncover. In the comments, leave the phrase, "I'm ready to discover the truth about the triplets." By doing so, you're joining a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid to face the inexplicable. Welcome to the journey. You're one of us now. Prepare yourself, because what comes next contains a key revelation that will forever change the way you see the human mind. The small town of Willow Creek, Ohio in 1975, was a place where secrets clung to the air like damp fog. Nestled among cornfields and crumbling barns, it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, or so they thought. In a modest clapboard house on the edge of town, Margaret and Thomas Reed welcomed their identical triplet daughters, Anna, Clara, and Elise. The townsfolk called it a miracle, a rare blessing. But even then there were whispers. The midwife, an old woman with trembling hands, swore she heard the newborns cry in unison the moment they were born, their wails harmonizing like a chilling chorus. She never spoke of it again, but she stopped delivering babies after that night. By the time the triplets were toddlers, the Reeds' joy had curdled into unease. Anna, Clara, and Elise didn't behave like other children. They didn't fight over toys or seek individual attention. Instead, they moved as one, their tiny hands reaching for the same objects at the same precise moment, their laughter erupting in perfect sync. Margaret, a devout woman, kept a journal, its pages filled with frantic notes. They stared at each other for hours, no words, just knowing. She wrote of nights when she'd find them standing in a circle in their shared crib, their small faces illuminated by moonlight, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. It wasn't baby talk. It wasn't anything human. The townsfolk began to notice, too. At church, the triplets would sit motionless, their identical blue eyes fixed on the pastor as if they could see through him. One Sunday, when the pastor spoke of demons and possession, all 3 girls turned their heads in unison to stare at a woman in the back pew, a woman who'd been hiding an affair. She fled the church in tears, never to return. Word spread, and soon neighbors stopped inviting the Reeds to gatherings. Children avoided the triplets, whispering about the witch girls who knew things they shouldn't. By age 5, the triplets' behavior grew stranger. They'd draw identical pictures, disturbing images of eyeless faces and spiraling patterns, without ever speaking to each other. Teachers reported that when one triplet was scolded, all 3 would cry, even if the others were across the room. Once, when Anna fell and scraped her knee, Clara and Elise screamed and clutched their own knees, blood seeping through their untouched skin. The school nurse quit the next day, muttering about something unnatural. Margaret's journal entries grew desperate. "They're not mine anymore," she wrote. "It's like something else is inside them pulling the strings." Thomas, a practical man who worked long hours at the local factory, dismissed her fears as exhaustion. But even he couldn't ignore the night he found the girls in the backyard, standing barefoot in the snow, their breath visible in the freezing air. They were chanting softly, their voices weaving together in a melody that made his skin crawl. When he asked what they were doing, they turned as one and said, "Waiting for her." Who her was, they never explained. The Reeds tried to keep their daughter's strangeness hidden, but Willow Creek was a small town, and secrets had a way of festering. By 1985, when the triplets were 10, rumors swirled of a family cursed, of girls who could see into souls. Some said they were gifted, touched by God. Others whispered of something darker, a force that had taken root in the girls' minds, binding them in ways no one could comprehend. The Reeds, overwhelmed and isolated, made a decision that would set the stage for the horrors to come. They sought help from a psychiatrist in Cleveland, hoping science could explain what faith could not. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that the triplets' connection ran deeper than anyone could imagine. It wasn't just their minds that were entwined. Something else was there, lurking in the spaces between their thoughts, waiting for the right moment to surface. In the fall of 1985, the Reeds drove 2 hours to Cleveland, their old station wagon rattling along the highway, the triplets silent in the back seat. Margaret clutched a rosary, her knuckles white, while Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the road, refusing to glance at the girls in the rearview mirror. They were headed to meet Dr. Harold Kessler, a renowned psychiatrist who specialized in childhood behavioral disorders. His office, tucked in a gray stone building near the city's edge, smelled of antiseptic and old books. Kessler, a wiry man with thinning hair and sharp eyes, had seen troubled children before, but nothing like Anna, Clara, and Elise. The initial consultation was unsettling from the start. The triplets sat in a row, their identical faces expressionless, hands folded neatly in their laps. Kessler asked standard questions about their sleep, their habits, their interactions with others. The girls answered in unison, their voices soft but eerily synchronized as if rehearsed. "We sleep when the others sleep," they said. "We eat what the others eat." When Kessler asked what they dreamed about, they tilted their heads at the same angle and replied, "We don't dream alone." Margaret, sitting nearby, stifled a sob. Thomas stared at the floor. Kessler's notes, later discovered in hospital archives, reveal his growing unease. "The triplets exhibit an unprecedented level of synchronicity," he wrote. "Their responses suggest a shared cognitive process, possibly telepathic in nature, though I hesitate to use such a term. No known psychological condition explains this." He ordered a battery of tests, EEG scans, IQ assessments, psychological evaluations, but the results only deepened the mystery. Their brainwaves were identical, spiking and dipping in perfect harmony, even when the girls were in separate rooms. Their IQs were above average, but their answers to abstract questions were cryptic, often referring to the one who watches or the place between us. The physical anomalies were even more disturbing. During a routine exam, a nurse pricked Anna's finger for a blood test. Clara and Elise, sitting across the room, flinched and clutched their own fingers, where tiny drops of blood appeared on unbroken skin. Kessler, a man of science, dismissed it as a trick of the light, but the nurse refused to work with the triplets again. "They're not right," she told a colleague, her voice shaking. "It's like they're one person split 3 ways." Kessler's fascination grew, but so did his apprehension. He began to notice the triplets watching him, not with the curiosity of children, but with a knowing intensity that made his skin prickle. One afternoon, as he reviewed their files, Clara spoke without prompting. "You're afraid of your wife leaving you." Kessler froze. He hadn't told anyone about his crumbling marriage, not even his closest colleagues. The other 2 girls smiled faintly, their eyes locked on his. From that moment, he began locking his office door at night. Desperate for answers, Kessler consulted colleagues across the country, sharing anonymized case details. Most dismissed the triplets as a case of extreme codependency or shared delusion, but one neurologist, Dr. Evelyn Marsh, suggested a radical theory. The girls might be exhibiting a form of quantum entanglement in their neural pathways, a phenomenon seen in physics but never in human biology. It's as if their consciousnesses are linked at a fundamental level, she wrote. Kessler scoffed at the idea. It was too far-fetched, too unscientific. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond his understanding was at play. Meanwhile, the reeds were unraveling. Margaret's faith wavered. She began to see the triplets' behavior as a sign of something demonic. She begged Thomas to take them to a priest, but he refused, clinging to the hope that Kessler could fix them. The girls, now 11, seemed to sense their parents' despair. They grew quieter, their synchronized movements more precise, their cryptic whispers more frequent. One night, Margaret woke to find the triplets standing at the foot of her bed, their eyes glinting in the dark. "She's coming," they said in unison. When Margaret asked who, they only smiled. Kessler, unaware of the growing tension at home, made a fateful decision. He recommended the triplets be admitted to St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital for long-term observation. He believed that a controlled environment might reveal the root of their condition. The Reeds, exhausted and desperate, agreed, unaware that this choice would push the triplets, and those around them, toward a darkness no one could have predicted. In the winter of 1986, St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital loomed like a forgotten fortress on the outskirts of Cleveland, its brick facade weathered by decades of neglect. The Reeds arrived under a slate-gray sky, their triplets bundled in identical coats, clutching each other's hands as they stepped into the hospital's echoing halls. Anna, Clara, and Elise, now 11, didn't cry or protest as their parents signed the admission papers. They simply watched, their blue eyes tracking every movement with an unnerving calm, as if they'd known this moment was coming. Margaret wept as she kissed them goodbye, whispering prayers under her breath. Thomas, stoic as ever, promised to visit soon. Neither noticed the faint, identical smiles on their daughters' faces as the heavy doors closed behind them. Ward C, where the triplets were placed, was reserved for the hospital's most complex cases, patients whose conditions defied conventional treatment. The ward was a maze of locked doors, barred windows, and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. Nurses moved quickly, their footsteps sharp against the linoleum, while orderlies spoke in hushed tones about the strange girls in room 312. Dr. Kessler, who oversaw their care, had prepared detailed protocols. The triplets were to be kept together but closely monitored, their interactions recorded, their behaviors analyzed. He believed that isolating their shared phenomena in a clinical setting would unlock the mystery of their minds. He was wrong. From the first night, the triplets disrupted the ward's uneasy rhythm. Nurses reported hearing soft chanting from their room after lights out, a melodic hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. When confronted, the girls would fall silent, their faces blank. Surveillance cameras, grainy and unreliable in 1986, captured them sitting in a perfect triangle on the floor, their lips moving in unison, though no sound was recorded. The footage chilled the staff, who began to avoid room 312 unless absolutely necessary. One orderly, a burly man named Carl, claimed he saw their shadows merge into a single, shapeless form against the wall. He laughed it off later, but his hands shook when he spoke of it. The triplets' physical anomalies grew more pronounced. When Clara developed a fever, all three showed identical symptoms: sweating, flushed cheeks, and a temperature of exactly 101.3 degrees F, despite only Clara receiving medication. When Elise tripped and bruised her shin during a supervised walk, identical bruises appeared on Anna and Clara within hours, purple and precise, as if pressed by an invisible hand. Kessler, poring over their charts, noted these incidents with a mix of fascination and dread. "Their physiology seems to mirror their psychology," he wrote. "It's as if their bodies are as entangled as their minds." The other patients on Ward C began to react to the triplets' presence. A schizophrenic man, usually docile, started screaming about 3 girls who see through me, clawing at his own face until he drew blood. A woman with severe depression, confined to her bed, began drawing spirals on her walls, patterns eerily similar to the triplets' childhood sketches. The staff, already stretched thin, grew tense. Whispers spread of a curse, of something unnatural seeping into the ward. One nurse, a devout Catholic named Maria, hung a crucifix above her desk, muttering that the girls were touched by something older than God. Kessler, determined to maintain scientific rigor, dismissed the staff's fears as superstition. He doubled down on his observations, spending hours in the observation room watching the triplets through a one-way mirror. What he saw unnerved him. The girls rarely spoke to each other, yet their movements were perfectly coordinated, turning pages in books at the same moment, blinking in sync, even breathing as one. During one session, he asked them about their shared experiences. Anna, the designated speaker that day, tilted her head and said, "We're never alone. Dr. Kessler, she's always with us." When he pressed for details, all three girls stared at him, their eyes seeming to pierce through his carefully constructed professionalism. That night he dreamed of a faceless figure standing in a void, its voice a chorus of three. The hospital administration, concerned about the ward's growing unrest, pressured Kessler for answers. He proposed a controversial experiment, separating the triplets into different rooms to test the limits of their connection. The staff hesitated. Something about splitting the girls felt like tempting fate, but Kessler insisted. The decision was made and preparations began. Unbeknownst to him, the triplets already knew. In their room, they sat closer than ever, their hands intertwined, whispering words no one could decipher. The air around them seemed to hum with a strange energy, as if the very walls were bracing for what was to come. Block 5. The separation. The air in St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital felt heavier than usual on the morning of March 3, 1987, as Dr. Harold Kessler prepared to enact his most ambitious experiment yet. The plan was simple in theory. Separate Anna, Clara, and Elise into different rooms on Ward C to observe whether their inexplicable synchronicity persisted across physical distance. Kessler believed that breaking their physical proximity might disrupt whatever linked their minds, offering a clue to their condition. The staff, however, were less optimistic. Nurse Maria, clutching her crucifix, warned Kessler that splitting them feels like tearing something that shouldn't be torn. He brushed off her concerns, citing the need for empirical data, but a knot of unease tightened in his chest as he gave the order. The triplets were moved at dawn, each escorted by 2 orderlies to separate rooms at opposite ends of the ward. Anna was placed in room 301, Clara in room 315, and Elise in room 328. The rooms were identical, stark, with a single bed, a barred window, and a heavy door with a small observation slot. Surveillance cameras, though prone to static, were trained on each girl. The triplets showed no resistance as they were led away, their faces serene, their hands briefly touching as they parted. But as the doors locked behind them, a low hum seemed to ripple through the ward, unnoticed by most but felt in the bones of those who'd grown sensitive to the triplets' presence. Within hours, the effects were undeniable. In room 301, Anna sat cross-legged on her bed, her lips moving silently as if reciting something. In room 315, Clara mirrored her pose exactly, her lips forming the same inaudible words. In room 328, Elise did the same, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The cameras caught their synchronized movements, their breathing aligned down to the second. Kessler, watching the feeds in the observation room, felt his pulse quicken. He'd expected some connection to persist, perhaps a shared gesture or phrase, but this was something else. It was as if the walls between them didn't exist. By midday, the ward began to fracture. A patient in room 310 near Clara began banging his head against the wall, screaming about voices that aren't mine. Another patient, a catatonic woman in room 305, suddenly stood and scratched at her door, her nails leaving bloody streaks as she muttered about 3 shadows becoming 1. The staff, already on edge, reported strange sensations, sudden chills, fleeting shadows in their peripheral vision, a faint buzzing in their ears. Maria refused to enter any of the triplets' rooms, claiming she'd seen their reflections in the observation slots move when they didn't. The physical anomalies escalated. At 2:17 p.m., Anna scratched her arm absent-mindedly during a routine check. Within minutes, identical red welts appeared on Clara and Elise's arms, despite no contact with anything sharp. Kessler, reviewing the medical logs, noted that their vital signs, heart rate, blood pressure, even body temperature, remained identical across all 3, defying the laws of biology. He scribbled in his notebook, "Separation has not weakened their connection. If anything, it's amplifying it. What are we dealing with?" That night, the ward descended into chaos. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the cameras in all 3 rooms flickered, then went black for 13 seconds. When the feeds returned, the triplets were standing, facing the doors, their heads tilted at the same unnatural angle. The orderlies on duty swore they heard a single voice echoing through the ward, though the words were unintelligible. Maria, who'd stayed late to pray in the chapel, claimed it was a woman's voice, older, colder, not theirs. She quit the next morning, leaving her crucifix behind. Kessler, sleepless and haggard, reviewed the incident reports. The triplets' behavior was escalating, but so was their influence on the ward. Other patients were now drawing the same spiraling patterns the triplets had sketched as children, patterns that seemed to pulse under the fluorescent lights. The staff reported nightmares, vivid dreams of a faceless woman standing in a vast empty space, her voice a chorus of three. Kessler himself woke from a dream of the triplets standing in a circle, their eyes black, whispering his name. Desperate for answers, he contacted Dr. Evelyn Marsh, the neurologist who'd suggested quantum entanglement. She arrived at St. Mary's 2 days later, her face grim as she reviewed the data. "This isn't system. I'm sorry, it looks like your message got cut off. I'll assume you meant to say continue, and proceed with Block 6 of the script for the psychiatric triplets whose minds couldn't be explained by science. Let me know if you meant something else." Dr. Evelyn Marsh arrived at St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital on a frigid morning in March 1987, her briefcase stuffed with notes on the triplets case and a growing sense of unease. A neurologist with a reputation for tackling the unexplainable, she'd spent years studying anomalies of the human brain, but nothing had prepared her for Anna, Clara, and Elise. The ward was quieter than she'd expected, the air thick with an oppressive stillness, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The staff greeted her with nervous glances, their voices low as they recounted the events of the separation experiment, events that had left them shaken and the triplets' mystery deeper than ever. Marsh began her work immediately, observing the triplets through the one-way mirrors of their separate rooms. The girls, now 12, sat in identical postures, knees drawn up, hands clasped, eyes fixed on some unseen point. Their synchronicity was uncanny, their movements mirroring each other across the distance of Ward C's corridors. Marsh noted their pale faces, their unblinking gazes, and the faint hum that seemed to emanate from their rooms, though no one could pinpoint its source. "It's not just psychological," she wrote in her initial report. "There's a physiological component we can't yet grasp. Their connection defies spatial boundaries." She reviewed the data from the separation experiment, the identical welts, the synchronized vitals, the inexplicable camera blackout at 3:33 a.m. The incident reports described the staff's growing paranoia, shadows moving without sources, voices heard in empty halls, and nightmares plaguing everyone from orderlies to Kessler himself. Marsh, a scientist grounded in reason, dismissed the supernatural talk but couldn't ignore the patterns. The triplets' influence seemed to seep beyond their rooms, affecting patients and staff alike. The spiraling drawings, now scrawled across multiple patients' walls, bore an eerie resemblance to symbols Marsh had seen in studies of ancient rituals, symbols tied to concepts of unity and transcendence. Determined to test her quantum entanglement theory, Marsh designed a new experiment. She proposed placing the triplets in sensory deprivation chambers, sealed, soundproof pods designed to isolate them from external stimuli. If their connection persisted in total isolation, it would suggest a link beyond physical or environmental cues. Kessler, still rattled by the separation incident, approved the plan reluctantly, warning Marsh about the ward's deteriorating morale. "They're scared," he admitted, his voice low. "Not just of the girls, but of something else." The chambers were set up in a basement lab, 3 steel pods lined with foam and wired with sensors to monitor brain activity, heart rate, and skin response. On the morning of the experiment, the triplets were led downstairs, their steps synchronized, their faces serene. As they entered the pods, Elise whispered, "She sees us even here." Marsh, overseeing the setup, assumed she was a delusion, a shared hallucination. She ignored the chill that ran down her spine and sealed the pods. The results were staggering. Inside the chambers, the triplets' brainwaves remained identical, their EEGs showing synchronized spikes and troughs despite complete sensory isolation. Their heart rates aligned to the millisecond, their skin temperatures fluctuating in unison. At one point, Clara's pod registered a sudden spike in adrenaline. Seconds later, Anna and Elise's sensors showed the same. Marsh stared at the data, her scientific detachment fraying. "This shouldn't be possible," she muttered. "They're not communicating, they're sharing." But the experiment took a darker turn. At 3:33 a.m., the same time as the camera blackout days earlier, the sensors went haywire. All three pods reported a surge in electrical activity, as if an external force had interfered. The monitors flickered, displaying static interspersed with brief images of a shadowy figure. A woman, her face obscured, standing in a void. The staff monitoring the feeds recoiled, one technician swearing the figure turned toward the camera before the screens went black. When the pods were opened, the triplets were sitting upright, their eyes wide, chanting softly in that same unfamiliar tongue from their childhood. Their restraints designed to prevent movement were inexplicably loosened. Marsh's notes from that night are frantic, her handwriting uneven. The triplets are not the source. Something else is acting through them, using their connection as a conduit. I don't know what it is, but it knows we're watching. She recommended halting the experiment, but Kessler, driven by a mix of desperation and obsession, insisted they continue. The triplets were returned to their separate rooms, but the ward's atmosphere had shifted. The air felt charged, as if something had been awakened in the basement and was now moving through the walls. Patients began reporting vivid dreams of a woman with no face, her voice a blend of the triplets' tones. The spiraling patterns appeared in new places, etched into bed frames, scratched into windows. Even Marsh, a skeptic by nature, woke from a dream of standing in a vast, dark space, the triplets' voices echoing around her saying, "She's here now." The hospital's chapel, once a refuge for the staff, was found defaced one morning, its walls covered in the same spiraling symbols, the crucifix missing. The triplets, meanwhile, grew quieter, their synchronized movements more fluid, as if they were settling into whatever force bound them. They no longer spoke of her aloud, but their eyes seemed to follow something unseen, something that lingered just beyond the veil of perception, waiting for its moment to emerge. By late March 1987, St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital was a place unraveling at its seams. The air in Ward C carried a metallic tang, like the aftermath of a lightning strike, and the staff moved through their shifts with haunted eyes. The triplets, Anna, Clara, and Elise, remained in their separate rooms, but their influence seemed to seep through the walls, twisting the ward into something alive with dread. Dr. Harold Kessler, once driven by scientific curiosity, now chain-smoked in his office, his notes a chaotic sprawl of theories and fears. Dr. Evelyn Marsh, still reeling from the sensory deprivation experiment, began to question her own rationality, her dreams plagued by the same faceless woman the patients described. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a crucible, and the triplets were its fire. The ward's patients were deteriorating. Those closest to the triplets' rooms suffered most. A man in room 302, admitted for paranoia, began carving spirals into his arms, claiming, "She told me to make room for her." A teenage girl in room 320, previously mute, started speaking in a language that matched the triplets' childhood chants, her voice a hollow echo. The staff, too, were fraying. Orderlies called in sick, citing nightmares that left them waking in cold sweats. One nurse, a veteran of the ward, was found sobbing in a supply closet, clutching a stolen patient file and muttering about eyes in the walls. The spiraling symbols, now appearing in dust on windows and scratches on doors, seemed to pulse with a rhythm no one could explain. Kessler and Marsh convened a crisis meeting with the hospital's administration, their voices strained as they presented the mounting evidence, the synchronized vitals, the camera blackouts, the inexplicable injuries shared across the triplets' bodies. Marsh proposed a radical theory, one she barely believed herself. The triplets' connection might be a conduit for an external entity, something that used their shared consciousness as a gateway. "It's not possession in the religious sense," she clarified, her voice unsteady. "It's as if their minds are a bridge to something outside our understanding, something that's growing stronger." The administrators, pragmatic and concerned about liability, dismissed the idea as hysteria. They ordered the triplets reunited in a single room to stabilize the ward, believing their separation was the root of the chaos. The reunion took place on March 29th, under a sky bruised with storm clouds. The triplets were brought back to room 312, their original shared space. As the orderlies opened their doors, Anna, Clara, and Elise stepped forward in perfect step, their faces serene but their eyes gleaming with a strange intensity. When they entered the room, they stood in a triangle, hands clasped, and for a moment the air seemed to shimmer as if reality itself had flinched. The cameras, newly repaired, caught a flicker of static, and for a split second, a shadow seemed to loom behind them, a formless shape that vanished when the feed cleared. The ward's atmosphere shifted immediately. The other patients grew quieter, their outbursts less frequent, but the silence was not peaceful. It was the hush before a storm, heavy with anticipation. The triplets resumed their synchronized behaviors, but now they seemed more deliberate, their movements almost ritualistic. They sat in a circle, their lips moving in unison, chanting softly in that same unintelligible language. When a nurse approached to administer medication, all three turned their heads at once, their gazes locking onto her. "She knows you're hiding," they said, their voices blending into one. The nurse, a young woman named Sarah, dropped the syringe and fled, later confessing she'd been stealing painkillers from the hospital's supply. She resigned that night. Kessler, watching the reunion footage, felt a chill settle into his bones. The triplets' connection hadn't weakened in separation. It had grown, as if the distance had stretched their bond into something more potent, more dangerous. Marsh, analyzing the EEGs from the reunion, found something even more alarming. Their brainwaves now showed a fourth pattern, a subtle undercurrent that didn't match any known neural activity. "It's like a shadow signal," she told Kessler, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something's riding their frequency, and it's not them." The hospital's chaplain, Father Daniel, who'd been called in after the chapel's defacement, began visiting the ward uninvited. He insisted on meeting the triplets, claiming their behavior echoed stories he'd read in ancient texts, tales of vessels chosen to channel forces beyond human comprehension. Kessler, a staunch atheist, rebuffed him, but Marsh, shaken by her own findings, allowed Father Daniel to observe from the monitoring room. During his visit, the triplets stopped chanting and turned toward the one-way mirror, their eyes seeming to meet his through the glass. "She doesn't like you," they said in unison. Father Daniel paled, crossing himself, and left the hospital that day, refusing to return. As the days passed, the triplets' presence seemed to warp the ward's reality. Clocks in room 312 began running backward, stopping at 3:33 each night. The air around their door grew cold, even in the overheated ward. Staff reported hearing footsteps in empty corridors, always in sets of 3. Kessler, now sleeping in his office to avoid going home, woke one night to find a spiral drawn on his desk in ink he didn't recognize. The hospital was reaching a breaking point, and the triplets, or whatever was acting through them, showed no signs of stopping. The first week of April 1987 brought a suffocating tension to St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital, as if the building itself were tightening around its occupants. Ward C had become a place of whispered dread, where staff moved in pairs and patients flinched at shadows. The triplets, Anna, Clara, and Elise, now 12, sat in room 312, their presence a quiet epicenter of the ward's unraveling. Their synchronized movements had grown more intricate, their hands tracing invisible patterns in the air, their chants a low hum that seemed to resonate in the bones of anyone nearby. The spiraling symbols, once confined to drawings, now appeared in impossible places, etched into the frost on windows, burned faintly into the linoleum floor, even woven into the threads of a patient's blanket. No one could explain how they got there, but their presence felt like a warning. Dr. Harold Kessler, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, clung to his role as the rational observer, though his notes betrayed his crumbling resolve. "The triplets' behavior suggests a collective consciousness," he wrote, "but the anomalies, physical, temporal, environmental, point to something external exerting influence. I'm losing objectivity." Dr. Evelyn Marsh, equally worn, pored over the EEG data, fixating on the shadow signal she'd detected, a faint, untraceable pattern weaving through the triplets' brainwaves. She began to suspect it wasn't a signal at all, but a presence, something that used the girls' connection as a doorway. Her scientific training screamed against such thoughts, yet the evidence was undeniable. The ward was no longer just a hospital. It was a stage. The triplets' effect on others intensified. Patients who'd never met them began incorporating their chants into their speech, muttering phrases in that same alien tongue. A violent offender in room 317, previously unresponsive to therapy, started carving spirals into his bed frame with a smuggled spoon. His eyes vacant as he whispered, "She's coming through." The staff, too, were succumbing. An orderly named Tom, known for his stoicism, broke down during a shift, claiming he'd seen the triplets in his dreams, standing in a field of black grass, their mouths moving as one to call his name. He admitted to a secret he'd buried for years, a hit-and-run accident he'd never reported. The next day, he was found unconscious in a stairwell, his arm marked with a spiral-shaped bruise. Physical anomalies escalated. When Anna developed a rash on her cheek, identical rashes bloomed on Clara and Elise within hours, the patterns swirling like miniature galaxies. Blood tests showed identical anomalies in their white cell counts, as if their bodies were fighting the same unseen infection. The hospital's aging electrical system began to falter, lights flickering in sync with the triplets' breathing, especially at 3:33 a.m., a time that had become a grim ritual for the staff. One night, the ward's intercom system activated on its own, broadcasting a low harmonic hum that matched the triplets' chants. When technicians inspected it, they found no malfunction, just a faint spiral scratched into the speaker's wiring. Kessler and Marsh, pushed to their limits, attempted a new approach, direct confrontation. They entered room 312 together, armed with questions designed to probe the triplets' awareness of their condition. The girls sat in their triangle, their eyes tracking the doctors with an eerie calm. "Who is she?" Marsh asked, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. The triplets tilted their heads in unison, their lips curling into faint smiles. "She's the one who binds us," Anna said. "She's the one who sees," Clara added. "She's the one you'll meet," Elise finished. Their voices overlapped, a single sentence spoken in 3 parts chilling the room. When Kessler pressed for more, they fell silent, their gazes shifting to a point above his head, as if something hovered there. That night, the ward security cameras captured something inexplicable. At 3:33 a.m., the feed from room 312 showed the triplets standing, their arms raised, their fingers tracing spirals in the air. Behind them, a shadow, taller, broader, unmistakably feminine, flickered into view, its edges dissolving into static. The image lasted 4 seconds before the cameras cut out. When they rebooted, the triplets were back on their beds, sleeping or pretending to. The staff refused to discuss the footage, but Kessler and Marsh watched it in silence, the shadow's presence burning into their minds. The hospital administration, now flooded with complaints from staff and families, issued an ultimatum: resolve the triplets' case or transfer them to a high-security facility. Kessler, torn between fear and obsession, proposed a final experiment, a controlled hypnosis session to access the triplets' subconscious, hoping to uncover the source of their connection. Marsh agreed, but her notes reveal her growing terror. "We're not just studying them anymore. We're inviting something in." The hypnosis was scheduled for the following week, but the ward was already teetering on the edge of collapse, its walls seeming to pulse with the triplets' rhythm, as if the spiral was tightening around them all. By April 10, 1987, St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital had become a shadow of its former self, its corridors steeped in a pervasive dread that clung to the walls like damp rot. The triplets, Anna, Clara, and Elise, remained the epicenter of the ward's descent, their presence a silent force that warped everything around them. The spiraling symbols now appeared in places no one could explain, etched into the condensation on mirrors, traced in the dust on untouched shelves, even faintly visible in the veins of a dying plant in the staff lounge. The hospital staff, reduced to a skeleton crew after a wave of resignations, moved with the haunted precision of soldiers in a war zone. Dr. Harold Kessler and Dr. Evelyn Marsh, both hollow-eyed and driven by a mix of desperation and dread, prepared for their final gamble, a hypnosis session to plumb the depths of the triplets' shared consciousness. The session was set for a soundproof room in the hospital's basement, a sterile space with concrete walls and a single overhead light that flickered erratically. Kessler, who'd trained in hypnotherapy early in his career, would lead the session, while Marsh monitored the triplets' vitals and recorded every detail. The girls, now 12, were brought in at dusk, their identical faces serene but their eyes glinting with a knowing intensity. They sat in a triangle, their hands resting lightly on their knees, their breathing synchronized to a rhythm that made the air feel thick. As Kessler began the induction, speaking in a low, steady voice, he noticed their eyes never blinked, their gazes fixed on a point just beyond him, as if they were already halfway somewhere else. The hypnosis took hold faster than expected. Within minutes, the triplets' breathing slowed, their bodies slumping slightly, their faces slack but eerily identical. Kessler guided them deeper, asking them to describe what they saw. At first, their responses were fragmented, disjointed images of a dark field, a sky with no stars, a woman who isn't there. But as he pressed, their voices began to blend, speaking in unison with a cadence that sent chills through the room. "She's the one who binds us," they said, their words overlapping like waves. "She's the one who waits. She's the one you've called." Marsh, watching the monitors, saw their brainwaves align perfectly, the mysterious shadow signal now dominating the readings, its spikes sharp and relentless. The room's temperature dropped, the light flickering in time with the triplets' breaths. Kessler, sweat beading on his forehead, asked, "Who is she?" The girls' heads tilted in unison, their lips curling into faint smiles. "She's the one who sees through us," Anna said. "She's the one who knows you," Clara added. "She's the one you've invited," Elise finished. The words hung in the air, and for a moment Kessler felt a presence behind him, a weight, a shadow, a breath that wasn't his. Then the session spiraled out of control. The triplets began to chant, their voices no longer soft but resonant, filling the room with a harmonic drone that vibrated in the walls. The language was the same unintelligible tongue they'd spoken as children, but now it carried a force, as if each syllable were a key turning in a lock. The monitors surged, their screens flashing with static, and Marsh gasped as the shadow signal overwhelmed the EEGs, its pattern now a jagged spiral. The light above flickered violently, then shattered, plunging the room into darkness for 3 seconds. When it flickered back on, the triplets were standing, their eyes black and unreflective, their hands raised as if tracing something in the air. Kessler, his voice shaking, tried to end the session, but the girls didn't respond. Instead, they spoke as one. "She's here now." The air grew heavy, oppressive, and Marsh later swore she saw a shadow, taller, broader, unmistakably feminine, coalesce behind the triplets, its edges fraying into the darkness. The monitors went dead and a low hum filled the room, not from the girls but from the walls themselves. Kessler stumbled back, knocking over a chair while Marsh frantically tried to reboot the equipment. The triplets' chanting grew louder, the words twisting into something that felt alive, as if the sound itself were clawing its way into reality. The session was aborted when an orderly, alerted by the noise, burst into the room. The triplets fell silent, their eyes returning to their normal blue, their bodies slumping back into their chairs. But the room felt different, charged as if something had been left behind. Marsh's notes from that night are nearly illegible. "We opened something, not a door but a crack. It's here, and it's watching." Kessler, shaken to his core, refused to speak of the session, but he ordered the triplets returned to room 312 under strict isolation protocols. The hospital's administration, now on the verge of shutting down Ward C, demanded answers, but neither doctor could provide them. In the days that followed, the ward became a place of outright fear. The spiraling symbols spread further, appearing in the grout between tiles, the cracks in the ceiling, even the reflections in staff members' eyes. Patients reported seeing the triplets in places they couldn't be, standing in doorways reflected in windows, their faces flickering in the static of dead TV screens. Kessler began to suspect that the hypnosis had done more than access the triplets' minds. It had widened whatever conduit linked them to the entity they called she. The hospital was no longer just a stage, it was a vessel, and the triplets were its anchor. By mid-April 1987, St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital was a husk of its former self, its corridors echoing with the weight of unspoken terror. Ward C had become a no-man's land, where the remaining staff moved like ghosts, their faces drawn, their voices hushed. The triplets, Anna, Clara, and Elise, sat in room 312, their presence a relentless pulse that seemed to throb through the building. The spiraling symbols now covered every surface, appearing in places no hand could reach, etched into the underside of beds, carved into the mortar of the walls, even faintly visible in the ripples of water in a glass left untouched. The hospital was no longer a place of science. It was a crucible for something incomprehensible, and the triplets were its heart. Dr. Harold Kessler and Dr. Evelyn Marsh, both teetering on the edge of sanity, grappled with the aftermath of the failed hypnosis session. Kessler's notes, now scrawled in a trembling hand, described the triplets as conduits for an unknown force, possibly extra-dimensional. Marsh, once a skeptic, had begun sketching the spiraling symbols in her own notebook, as if compelled to map their pattern. "It's not just in their minds," she wrote. "It's in the air, the walls, the space between spaces. We've let it in." The shadow signal in the triplets' EEGs had grown stronger, its jagged spiral dominating their brainwaves, as if it were overriding their individuality. The ward's remaining patients were shells of themselves. Those who could still speak whispered of the woman who watches, their dreams filled with a dark field where the triplets stood, their voices a chorus summoning something vast. One patient, a former teacher admitted for severe anxiety, began writing pages of numbers, coordinates, equations, patterns that matched the spiral's geometry, though she had no mathematical training. When asked what she was doing, she said, "She's showing me where she's from." Her room was locked the next day, but the numbers appeared on the walls of other patients' rooms, as if carried by an unseen hand. The triplets themselves were changing. Their synchronized movements had become fluid, almost inhuman, their hands tracing spirals in the air with a precision that suggested purpose. Their eyes, once a clear blue, now seemed to flicker with flecks of black like static in a broken screen. They rarely spoke, but when they did, it was in that alien tongue, their voices weaving together in a harmony that made listeners' ears ache. The staff avoided room 312, but those who entered reported a pressure in the air, a feeling of being watched by something vast and unblinking. One orderly, tasked with delivering their meals, swore he saw their shadows stretch across the ceiling, merging into a single, towering form that pulsed with the rhythm of their chants. The hospital's infrastructure began to fail in ways that defied explanation. The power flickered constantly, always peaking at 3:33 a.m., when the triplets' chanting grew loudest. Clocks stopped or ran backward, their hands forming spirals before freezing. The water in the ward's pipes turned brackish, leaving faint spiral patterns in the sediment. The cameras, now barely functional, captured fleeting images of a feminine shadow moving through the halls, its form dissolving into static. Kessler, reviewing the footage, saw it linger outside his office, its head tilted as if listening. He stopped sleeping altogether, his desk littered with coffee cups and cigarette butts. The Reeds, who hadn't visited since the triplets' admission, were summoned by the hospital's administration, now desperate to transfer the girls to a high-security facility in upstate New York. Margaret and Thomas arrived on April 15th, their faces gaunt with guilt and fear. They demanded to see their daughters, but Kessler warned them against it, citing the ward's instability. Margaret, clutching her rosary, insisted, her voice breaking as she spoke of dreams where her daughters called her to join them. Against Kessler's protests, the Reeds were allowed a supervised visit in room 312. The reunion was catastrophic. As Margaret and Thomas entered, the triplets stood in unison, their eyes locking onto their parents. "You left us to her," they said, their voices a chilling blend. Margaret screamed, collapsing to her knees while Thomas froze, his face drained of color. The room's temperature plummeted and the cameras cut out, but not before capturing a shadow, taller, broader, its edges fraying, looming behind the triplets. When the feed returned, the Reeds were unconscious on the floor, their faces marked with faint spiral burns. The triplets sat calmly, their hands folded as if nothing had happened. The hospital administration, now facing lawsuits from staff and families, ordered the triplets' immediate transfer. Kessler and Marsh, both broken by what they'd witnessed, prepared the paperwork, but neither believed moving the girls would stop what was happening. The ward was no longer a hospital. It was a nexus, and the triplets were its anchor. As the transfer date approached, the spirals grew more intricate, their patterns weaving through the very fabric of the building. The air hummed with a low, relentless drone, and every night at 3:33 a.m., the ward seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when the triplets and whatever they channeled would finally act. The night of April 17, 1987, hung over St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital like a shroud. the air thick with an electric tension that made every sound, every creak of the floor, every flicker of the lights feel like a prelude to collapse. Ward C was a ghost town, its remaining staff reduced to a handful of diehards too stubborn or too broken to leave. The triplets, Anna, Clara, and Elise, sat in room 312, their presence a silent vortex that seemed to pull the world toward it. The spiraling symbols had overtaken the ward, weaving through cracks in the walls, shimmering in the air like heat waves, and pulsing in the shadows cast by flickering bulbs. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a wound, and the triplets were its beating heart. Dr. Harold Kessler and Dr. Evelyn Marsh, both shadows of their former selves, stood on the precipice of the unknown. Kessler's hands trembled as he signed the transfer orders, his once meticulous notes now a chaotic scrawl of spirals and half-formed thoughts. Marsh, her skepticism shattered, clutched her notebook filled with sketches of the symbols, convinced they held the key to whatever force bound the triplets. The transfer to the high-security facility was set for dawn, but neither doctor believed it would end the nightmare. The triplets' connection, whatever it was, had grown too vast, too invasive to be contained by walls or distance. The Reeds, still recovering from their catastrophic visit, refused to return, leaving the hospital staff to handle the triplets alone. Margaret's rosary lay abandoned in room 312, its beads arranged in a perfect spiral on the floor. Thomas, haunted by the memory of his daughter's accusing voices, had stopped speaking altogether, his eyes distant as if he, too, saw the shadow that lingered behind them. The hospital administration, desperate to wash their hands of the case, had barred media access, but rumors had already leaked to the press, whispers of cursed triplets and a ward gone mad. The truth, however, was far stranger and far darker than any headline could capture. At 3:33 a.m., the ward shuddered. The cameras, already unreliable, went black, their feeds replaced by static that seemed to hum with the triplets' chants. The staff on duty reported a sudden drop in temperature, their breath visible in the air, and a low, harmonic drone that vibrated through the walls. In room 312, the triplets stood in their triangle, their hands raised, their fingers tracing spirals that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The air around them shimmered as if reality were fraying, and for a moment the shadow, taller, broader, unmistakably feminine, took form behind them. Its edges pulsed with the rhythm of their chants, its presence a weight that pressed against every mind in the ward. Then, silence. The cameras flickered back on at 3:36 a.m., revealing an empty room. The triplets were gone. Their beds were untouched, the restraints unbuckled but intact, the door still locked from the outside. The spiraling symbols, once omnipresent, had vanished, leaving the walls bare and the air eerily still. The staff searched the ward, then the entire hospital, but found no trace of Anna, Clara, or Elise. It was as if they'd dissolved into the ether, taking whatever force they'd channeled with them. The transfer orders, still on Kessler's desk, were marked with a single spiral in red ink, its lines trembling as if drawn by an unsteady hand. Kessler and Marsh were left to piece together the impossible. The EEG data from that night showed a final surge in the shadow signal, a spike so intense it burned out the monitors. The security footage, recovered days later, showed nothing but static during the critical 3 minutes, though some swore they saw a faint outline of 3 figures merging into one before the feed cut out. The hospital's records of the triplets, charts, photos, even their admission papers were found defaced, covered in spirals that seemed to shift when viewed too long. The Reeds, when contacted, refused to speak of their daughters, as if saying their names might summon them back. The official report called it an escape, a failure of security, but those who'd been in Ward C knew better. The triplets hadn't fled. They'd been taken, or they'd gone willingly, drawn into whatever realm their connection had opened. Kessler resigned a week later, his career in ruins, his dreams haunted by a faceless woman whose voice was a chorus of 3. Marsh disappeared shortly after, leaving behind her notebook, its final page a single sentence. They were never just girls. They were a door. The hospital closed Ward C permanently, its rooms sealed, though maintenance workers reported hearing faint chants behind the locked doors years later. The triplets' fate remains a mystery. Some say they vanished into the Ohio wilderness, living as recluses bound by their shared mind. Others whisper of a government cover-up, claiming the girls were taken to a black site facility for study. A few, those who'd seen the shadow, believe something else entirely. That the triplets crossed into a place beyond our world, guided by the entity they called she. The spiraling symbols, once a hallmark of their presence, have appeared in other places since, carved into trees in remote forests, painted on abandoned buildings, even whispered in the dreams of strangers who've never heard of St. Mary's. You who've followed this story to its end are part of a rare few who've dared to look into the abyss of the triplets' mystery. You've seen the fragility of the human mind, the terror of a connection too deep to fathom, and the possibility that some truths are too vast for our world to hold. Congratulations for staying with us, for facing the inexplicable with courage. Now let your voice be heard in the comments. Share the phrase, "This story changed my way of seeing the human mind." By doing so, you join a community of seekers who refuse to shy away from the shadows, who demand to know what lies beneath the surface of reality. Share this video with others, so they too can glimpse the darkness that lingers where science fails. Let the world know that some stories, like the triplets, are not just tales but warnings etched in spirals that pulse in the corners of our minds. Subscribe to this channel, become part of our circle, and keep your eyes open for the next truth we uncover. The human mind is a labyrinth, and within it, something is always watching. Will you dare to keep searching?